Hello, this is Soul, and today I'm going to be making the mistake of talking more about these conversations about all the loot distribution changes coming in Dragonflight. It's just another day of choosing violence. It's a sensitive subject, right? We've got our takes, I've got my own, but the purpose of today's video is not exactly to persuade, but to, I guess, share what I've learned over the past few days with talking with people and well, to emphasize that neither the talking points nor the proposed solutions are as simple or as easy as we may think. You're probably not gonna like this video, but you know, the usual, if you can hit that anyway and subscribe for more content, I would very much appreciate that. So let's recap. Just the other day, there were announcements talking about changes to loot distribution in Dragonflight that sum up to very simply that personal loot is going away, group loot is coming back with some changes. There are some small changes to group loot to improve the quality of life, like for example, if the exact same two pieces of gear drop, people can roll on both of them, but they can't win both of them. It'll turn out that the second highest roll will automatically get that second piece. Also, loot can be traded around freely within the group, but you know, with the usual lockouts in place. And I'm not going to get too much into like the reactions, except that they are, one, they're very strong, but two, well, I'm gonna lump them into a few categories. Like, one reaction is that this is great, cool, people can choose to roll on things again, and the power of loot sharing and social systems, it's being given back to players. Two, of course, is that this is the literal worst. It's, you know, personal loot came about for a reason, right? And going in this direction is only a step backward. And then three, sure, group loot can be a thing, but it should be a choice between that and personal loot. And here are the many different rules and conditions that I think are fantastic ideas. Now, these concerns, these opinions and suggestions, including my own, they don't come from nowhere. They come from personal experience and anecdotes and things that we've heard about, statements from the World of Warcraft team and more, so by their nature they're all a little bit biased. So we're going to attempt to take the emotion out of this and explain what is the difference between group loot and personal loot, but we're going to come at this from a different angle, because there's so much focus on who deserves to get what after the things drop and all that, but not enough attention on the things that are actually dropping. I think that's very important in this grander conversation. So I'm gonna put up some B-roll, I'm gonna put up some crappy pictures somehow and illustrate. We'll start off with these 10 players in raid. Now, we know the basics, that 2 pieces of loot are going to drop between these 10 people, that's the minimum. Each person added will increase the odds that another piece of loot will drop by 20% per player until there's a 100% chance that a third piece of loot will drop, and then it's another 20% until the next, and so on and so forth. Our example is going to stick with these 10 people because it's easy. So when a boss is killed, the kind of loot that drops is merely based on the number of people in the group and the boss's loot table, and that's it. There may be hidden values behind a certain thing dropping, like for example the Sylvanas bow, but the choice of drops is random. It's blind to who is in the group, what their class is, their armor type, or whatever. None of that matters. Loot specialization only determines who will win the roll. The stuff is already dropped. It's all about who wins the roll. And if a hunter weapon drops and there are no hunters in the raid, well, tough luck, we're gonna shard it. Like it or not, it's easy enough to argue that even before the rolls are done or loot is traded between players, that the way that group loot works, it's a fair loot system because there's no bias towards the group composition. By comparison, personal loot does some funny stuff in the background. So in so few words, what it does is it selects 2 of the 10 players in the group to receive loot. From there, the loot table is filtered based on the 2 winners' loot specialization or preference, and then the loot is given to said winners. Unlike group loot, personal loot is biased because what drops is influenced by your group composition, meaning that it's possible to manipulate loot drops by manipulating the group makeup. The bias is not like a bad thing, it's not a negative, but there are benefits and drawbacks to it. The obvious benefit is that something usable will always drop, and thanks to loot specializations, the drops are even more accurate. The drawback is a little bit subtle, so I'm going to try to lead you into it. Let's start off with a really extreme example. Let's use a raid comprised of 10 druids. I talked about this just the other day. Using personal loot, 10 druids who clear a raid are guaranteed to always have loot drop that someone in the group can use. Whether it's an upgrade or not isn't part of this conversation, and again, this is a very extreme sample that a very small percentage of players are actually going to practice. I'm just pointing out an example where personal loot can be manipulated to the group's benefit. If this was a group loot situation though, this sort of comp isn't ideal at all because the loot table doesn't care who's in the group, and it's very likely that this group will feel frustrated with so few drops that are for them, and on top of that you got 10 players to fight for those usable drops. So let's go with a more realistic example. Now we're back at 10 players, and for the sake of simplicity, we'll split the sample among the 4 armor types: cloth, leather, mail, and plate. And we'll ignore role and specializations because that kind of complicates things further. Leather is the most common armor type right now. Evokers are the brand new class in Dragonflight, and hunters are hunters. So in this also unrealistic but more likely example, a group could have 3 leather wearers, 3 mail, 2 cloth, and 2 plate users. Now this works great for either of the loot systems, at least before roles and social systems play a part. Group loot will drop 2 pieces that at least 2 people are capable of using. Personal loot will give 2 pieces to eligible players based on their loot spec, and that's kind of it, that's the end of the story. But that's just one story. The reality is that group comps will vary with nearly infinite combinations. Not all loot tables from boss to boss are made equal. One armor or spec or role type is more represented than another in most cases. Sometimes there aren't any plate users that day, right? Sometimes there's only 1 cloth user, or other times half your DPS is comprised of hunters. Repeating myself, group loot does not care what your comp is. No hunters in group? Shoot, well, that means there's going to be a real fear that guns and bows are going to drop. It's a real situation where loot is basically dead or it's sharded, and it sure backs up the idea that personal loot is the superior system because something is always guaranteed to drop for someone. That's why the idea of keeping personal loot and lifting all of the trade restrictions is a really popular idea that the WoW team could relent to if enough pressure is applied. But there's a double-edged sword to that. It means that in situations where a certain loot spec is in the minority, whether it's based on the armor type or if it's range versus melee, DPS versus healer versus tank spec, whatever, the majority is favored and the minority is kind of suppressed. In a group of 10 people, where everyone's loot spec is the same as their actual spec, there's a 20% chance that a tank will be chosen to receive loot under personal loot, followed by choosing from the tanking loot table, which may or may not have a tank-specific item. Assuming that the rest of the team of 10 is made up of 2 healers and 6 DPS, it's a 20% chance for healer-specific gear and 60% chance for DPS. Now, notice I'm talking about roles and not armor type. I've kind of detoured into talking about weapons and trinkets. I'm also super oversimplifying because not every boss drops every type of item for every spec or role. But whatever the case, this makes the odds for certain weapons and trinkets, which already feel like they're a low drop chance, feel even lower. Fortunately, with personal loot, we can change our main spec to whatever we want, perhaps to manipulate how gear drops, although that's dependent on whether the other members of the raid are willing to also change their said specialization, and on top of that, are willing to trade that item down. And here we get into like this kind of social part of loot distribution in personal loot. In most pug situations, though, I imagine that people will, by default, loot spec in a way that enriches themselves over others. The small takeaway here is that there are conditions where personal loot runs a risk of you having worse odds of receiving loot if you happen to be in the minority, whereas group loot doesn't care. Personal loot is sometimes better, and some would say that overall personal loot returns bigger net positives than group loot does. But I'm trying to put a spotlight on the fact that with personal loot, there's this bias based on group comp, which some players have control over. For me, as someone who runs a guild and who only plays one class and specialization, I admit that I've been totally blind to this bias. I only vaguely recall some guildmates comment that, "Oh no, I'm the only clothy in the group, I'm hardly gonna get anything." And some people have been playing that game that I've only just really realized. And here's what's funny, like for the most part, throughout Shadowlands, I was more often than not the only plate user in the group, or at least the only person with constant attendance. I subconsciously settled with the fact that I'm hardly ever going to see plate or one-handed strength weapons, and to be honest, I haven't. So what if Blizzard did relent and give players a choice between group and personal loot that, group leaders in pugs or guild can choose between one or the other? And never mind what the restrictions could be for a moment. Like, let's go back to the 10-man example and assume that this is a progression run where everything that drops is an upgrade. As a group leader, you gotta ask yourself, like, which version of group loot should we choose? If the armor type was split down the sort of middle, it's not going to make much of a difference which system was used. But what if the group comp was not so balanced? What if in a comp that otherwise looked balanced, there was actually only one agility melee user in the group? Then the loot system matters quite a bit. It would mean that out of the 10 role possibilities in this certain group, there's only one chance for that one person to be chosen to maybe get a melee-based weapon or a trinket to drop. Now, we've gone through that thing already, but there's also a social problem that arises with giving group leaders this choice. So think of yourself. Think of, what if you're the one? What if you're the lone DPS type in your group? Everyone else is loot spec differently for whatever reason, or they have a different armor type, so it means that there's no possibility of gear being traded down to you. It's not going to happen. Now, you can win the personal role, obviously, but in this case, you must win. So seeing those odds, it's like, okay, maybe you ask the group leader, hey, can we do group loot for the raid or even this one boss so I can get a better shot at getting gear? And what if the group leader says no? Dang. So what sort of situation just happened there? Personal loot is creating a bias towards the majority of loot specs present, which in turn gives the minority this disadvantage. But is that so bad? No, it's not that bad. At least I don't think so. Because, after all, there are more DPSers than tanks and healers, duh. And if there's more than one loot spec type than another, why shouldn't more stuff drop for them? The numbers work. They work out just fine. But at the same time, this is loot, which we can all probably agree can easily become a very emotional thing. Like, screw the numbers and the logic. What does it communicate to that minority when the group leader or the group vote goes for a loot system that is not in your favor or their favor? Do they take that personally? Do they feel left out, less important, demotivated to even participate in that group anymore? The answers to that aren't the point. It's that the question can even be asked if we have the opportunity to choose between personal and group loot. If there is no choice, which is kind of what the announcement said, then we can blame the system. We can blame the WoW team exclusively. But choice gives the player the power, the responsibility, and the consequences if they do choose personal or group loot. If I'm advocating that we shouldn't be able to choose between personal or group loot, then the question kind of comes up, does personal loot still have a place anywhere? And I think it does. I think it works out just fine in queued content like Raid Finder, as well as small group content like Dungeon Finder and Mythic Plus. Because in dungeons, the pool of players who are rolling on loot is small and it's fixed, which weakens the impact of that bias. And unlike raids, dungeons can be repeated over and over again for loot. Raid Finder is 30-man group content, but also the group is randomly assembled. Like when we queue up, there's no leader who decides who gets into the group or how loot is passed out. Group comp doesn't even matter, beyond there being just enough tanks, healers, and DPS, because getting the run going is priority number one. And people are there for different reasons. Like within that group, one person might be in there for upgrades, of course. Another might be, they might not need upgrades, but they're there with a friend and they plan on colluding, like they want to trade gear among each other, and really there's nothing anyone can do about that. Another still might be the super overpowered DPS or tank or healer who's just there for transmog. Like people are there for all sorts of different reasons. But in a group loot situation, all of those reasons would equate to hitting need on that loot. And we just might hate them for that. Like, I'll stick my neck out right here, right now, for real. If I'm in Raid Finder and I see transmog drop that I don't have, I'm gonna keep it. And if Dragonflight Raid Finder switches to group loot and stuff drops that unlocks transmog, regardless of it being an upgrade, I will need on it, because that's why I queued up. Simple as that. Just like how your goal may be to get stronger so you can play tougher content and complete your collections, my goal too is to complete my collection, because we're on week 20 of this season and it's definitely going to drop this time. I could think of bloated solutions for like group loot and how priorities should work, like tiered priorities, like if it's an upgrade versus transmog, and we can think of all like some fangled system that tracks if you've looted it before, so it's not so easy to win rolls to trade to others, but then it gets needlessly complicated. And that is why personal loot has its place. It avoids the unnecessary attention of people seeing others roll need on something that doesn't fit their definition of need. And that's also kind of the weird thing about personal loot. It's like everyone rolls need anyway. We just don't really know who actually needs that gear or how much they beat us by. Personal loot just simplifies what our definition of need is, and it tries to shield us from scrutiny, but it's also biased towards a group makeup that nobody asked for. So like I said at the start of this, I'm not here to talk you folks into much of anything, except to say that the decision behind this change and reintroducing group loot as a non-choice might be a little bit more thoughtful than we first realized. Like, maybe the WoW team should have communicated this, maybe they don't quite realize it themselves, and maybe I'm just hella wrong. But I wanted to share, and I appreciate you listening. So please leave a comment and come at it with the energy that you want to be heard. That doesn't mean that we should talk each other's opinions down, but you can do it to me. It's not a big deal. I can handle it. Thanks for coming. Like the video, subscribe for more. See you next time. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay breezy. Bye.